Yo, what is up guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking about a bunch of party builds for the Crucible League expansion in 3.21 and POE. Now I have a bit of bad news here. I myself personally will not be playing this league. I had a family trip scheduled to Barcelona, which had been scheduled a while back. And due to the delay of the Sanctum League being delayed a month, it just so happened to line up with my travel plans. I wasn't going to cancel my travel plans to play POE. Also a little bit not happy with the current state of the game personally. Take a little bit of a mental reset and then hopefully engage with the game a little bit more in the summer when the POE 2 beta starts. That being said, I have kept up with all of the changes. I have updated all of the builds, and there's some new things to talk about as well as some potential new strategies that you can employ with the new content in the new league. So I'll be talking about that as well. First things first, and that is the carry and the carry skill. In reality, Spark is just by far and away the best spell to be playing in the game right now. Even with a 25% prod speed nerf that we have found on the patch, it is still just so much better than every other spell mechanically. Now, that prod speed nerf is going to hurt the most when you're doing bossing in enclosed arenas. Where the skill really shined was where you could pre-lay a bunch of sparks down, get a bunch of prod speed. And if you're just planning on going mapping, then Spark definitely still going to be one of the best choices for you. I wouldn't shy away from the skill just because there's a 25% prod speed nerf. I'm not going to try and give a ton of advice on that since it's not really my area of engagement in the game. The Deadeye Sparker was unironically way more damage than we'd ever experienced on any of the other ascendancies we'd try Sparker. And Deadeye is just honestly so much more damage because of the chains and the extra prod. It's like just mind-blowing, to be honest. It's a little bit squishier than other variants because Assassin gets a bunch of access to elusive. Inquiz, of course, gets the regen. From the previous patch, this build has not really changed. A few highlights here is we are still deleting our power charges in favor of frenzy charges so that we can click the altar node. Getting a bunch of prod speed on our cluster jewels. Secrets of Suffering so we don't freeze things. The build itself isn't super complicated. It is the trademark double Nebulous, double Call of the Brotherhood, Incandescent Heart. You've seen this probably 10 times by now, but somehow Nebulous still eludes a nerf. This item is so fucking OP. It's crazy to me that it hasn't been changed after all this time. But the solution is to just nerf all the content that makes Nebulous necessary. A little backwards to me. Still getting a respectable amount of prod speed. A lot of it's coming from a Blood and Sand linked to Enhance. We're sitting at a 2.46 multiplier to your prod speed here. As you can see, our average hit is hovering around 85 million. Quite a lot. It'll carry the end game. Very highly recommend the Deadeye Sparker. It performed extremely well. There are, however, a few interesting changes to the Aura bot that we can mention this patch. First major change. The patch notes here changed some of the Abyss uniques. One of them is the Bubonic Trail. Bubonic Trail now has, this is probably a new best in slot for a lot of boots. You can see it has an ES rating of 22 here. It's not very good. It allows you to free up a lot of other spots on your build. You also get an Abyss socket, which you can put an Abyss jewel in. You can easily get int ES and maybe a corruption for some more efficiency. Not completely mandatory. One other thing to mention here is the Darkness and Throne unique belt now has up to 100% increased effective Abyss jewels. For example, on this Searching Eye, you can go from 2 to 4% reservation efficiency of skills, which will help in the long run on the belt, which is actually pretty massive. However, I think that shit'll be a little expensive. So while that might be a really good end game or like mid game, those 100% belts are going to be quite expensive. And I actually don't think they're worth using unless it's actually 100%. One other change that affected the Orbot here was the Pathfinder node, which helps a little bit for your flask sustain. However, unfortunately the +1 utility flask mastery here was just straight up deleted. And while you did get 10% chance to not consume back, that is kind of adding a little bit of an element of RNG to your uptime. That one utility mastery was providing you a lot of flash charges. It's a lot harder to get to 100% uptime now without a belt. You can check the uptime by hovering the flask, and as you can see here, it says the uptime is 100%. Last change we need to go over is the fact that the specific masteries for Grace, Determ, and Discipline, those reservation specific masteries have all been deleted. So to compensate for that, you can do a few things. One thing you can do is just quickly take Thrill Killer for 2 points. If you're duoing or you're not relying on the Sextant, most people are going to be pathing to Dreamer anyways so that they can turn on their blessing. And so in that case, you'd of course path to Dreamer and take it here instead. I'm also opting for the pathing that goes all the way around, pathing all the way down to Champion of the Cause, and it gets you into a 5-orb Deli T16 mapping state as fast as possible with the lowest cost. But this variant of Orbot, where you path all the way around, has a reliance on this jewel getting 3 superiorities, and all of this shit is dirt cheap. So this is the variant I would go to if you're trying to build one early on. You hop off the Victarios. You can also get Forbidden Jewels with Champion, of course, and then you can consider pathing out of Champion here to go and get Champion of the Cause that way. Those are all, of course, upgrades you can make, but those are kind of like higher end, more expensive things. This baseline right here is probably where you want to be for 5-orb T16 mapping. And I would definitely recommend the Victario's version and then path all the way around. It works super well. It's super cheap. Highly recommend. One thing to note here is that because we are using bubonics, this used to be our slot for +2 to get our purities to level 23. And now I'm assuming that these boots are going to be a little bit more expensive, a little bit more rare because people want the reservation efficiency. So I moved the +2 to the shield. And I've fudged the sockets a little bit, but one main change is that you no longer get +2 on your boots, and you do need to get it on the shield. Other than that, all of this gear is complete garbage. I have an iron ring on, for instance. The expensive build enabling stuff is going to be a synth helm with 15 aura effect. You can just use a rare helmet until you get the synth helm and replace it later. Moving on to the Cursebot. Basically, I think Anathema with its current price is just going to be best in slot for the Cursebot, obviously. For very little investment, you just invest a little bit on the tree for some power charges. Super easy. It's also anointing the Star of Ray class for +1 power charge here. But yeah, it's the same formula as before. Has a heavy reliance on Veteran Defender into small cluster jewels. Path around the outside, get all the curse effect on the tree. Get some ES on the tree. Grab the power charge while you're here. More cluster jewel with the same Veteran Defender and the same smalls. It's all pretty cookie cutter. And then the last thing to do is make sure you get a beefy shield. This shield is honestly kind of dog shit, but you can definitely get a beefy one that's like 320 and it increases your ES pool a lot. But yeah, Anathema makes building a Cursebot extremely trivial. It's so easy to get all the max curses. You can fit so much more into the build now that the Cursebot just brings so much power to the table. It is still very good. Anyways, moving on to the Mana Guardian. This shit is still unchained. There's not really much to speak on this build. It didn't really get hit by the aura-specific reservation changes. And that's going to move us on to the Culler here. The main debate I have internally is whether or not a Culler is worth running in the current state of the game. There's an argument to be made that the amount of rarity stacking and the amount that the Culler slows down your party is not worth it. A very large argument to be made where you can drop a substantial amount of the rarity, but keeping all of the quant and have a carry be self-sufficient with a headhunter or something like that. That being said, I think there are certain areas in the game which a Culler can excel at. I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later in the video. I know there's a lot of talk about this particular keystone and how much recovery it can provide for you. So there might be a variant of the Culler that maybe doesn't use Pet Blood and just stays on full life. Just know that you are losing 5 flask effect from speccing it. So that's just one thing to keep in mind here with the Culler. Last thing to quickly touch on here is, of course, the mine support. Now, there was a Sabo rework. However, a bunch of the nodes that this thing was relying on wasn't really touched or changed. So this build is still performing at its peak to provide just that extra layer of damage for your party. Super cheap to build, super easy to transition to. Once again, you don't need to equip the Kingmaker on this character if you can build an AG, but just know that you always have the option to slap this on this character if you need to. Same with the Garb of the Ephemeral. But yeah, there's not really any meaningful changes to talk about here. As for duo builds, I do have a POB that I usually put out. But instead, I'm going to send you over to Halo and Zeke. Those guys do a great job of explaining like duo-specific strategies because they have been doing duo for so long. So if you have any duo-specific questions, go check out Halo. He's a super knowledgeable guy. I'm sure he'll be able to answer any questions you guys might have regarding duo-specific setups. Now that all of the builds are out of the way, maybe some potential strategies you guys can do on League Start if you're planning on starting in a group. The number of breach splinters dropped are now affected by increases and reductions to item quantity. As a group player, reading this gives me anxiety because I feel like this is going to create a really bad dynamic where the price of breach splinters is going to be dictated by people that are MFing them. But if you are MFing in a group, this is something you should really keep your eye out for. And now you're going to have to be getting a lot of these splinters from engaging with breach itself. But I foresee a lot of complaints if MFing for these breach splinters is going to become the norm. So breach is one interesting thing that came with this patch. The other big change that came here was Abyss. Honestly, Abyss used to be one of the best juicing mechanics before. It just spawned so many fucking rares. It was like unbelievable. But honestly, reading through all of these changes and also looking at how much they nerfed the Scarab, I just get this gut feeling like this is going to be the Beyond rework 2.0. I see breach being a horizontal change where this is probably, if not a slight buff. I see Abyss as being just a straight nerf to the content in terms of juicing. Now, of course, you're going to be able to get all the uniques and stuff, but in terms of a juicing mechanic, I think Abyss is probably dead. That's just my initial thoughts. Obviously, I could be wrong. There could be, maybe it's not as bad on the new patch as I think it might be, but just my gut feeling here is that this shit is just gone as a juicing mechanic. So there is one last thing to talk about here in regards to a mapping strategy. The first thing is going to be your early game strategy. I think there's a ton of viable things you can do in a group. The first one being the heist strat that we did last league, where we 6-man looted the urn at the end of the heist and just returned. That somehow didn't get nerfed. Additionally, poverty methods like Ruckus is still pretty good. Get into the end game and you're choosing your end game farming activity. The place of Kirac maps in endgame MFing. So last league, we decided to do Kirac mod, and they're just okay. Nothing groundbreaking, it's solid, but when doing these Kirac maps, you're faced with a choice. The Kirac maps are specifically, this map's modifiers to quantity of items found also apply to rarity. Now, these are specifically found from the vendor here. The catch is that these only spawn on natural maps. So there's a few constraints you have to deal with if you want to engage with this content. The first of which being is that the map can have a really bad mod on it. In this case, it was purchased with minus max, which you have to try to either annul and then exalt it back to full, which is a bit expensive. It can cost like 30-40 C to get this map full of affixes. On top of that, if you want this map to have access to Searing Exarch or Eater altars on the map, it needs to be a 14 through 16, or obviously you can't click the altars. So that means it needs to be a map with good mods that randomly spawns, that is also a good layout, that is on a tier 14, 15, or 16. And on top of that, if you want it to be even more efficient, you want that map to have a good card. Being able to have a good div card, as well as being able to stack rarity and farm, is going to be the most ideal scenario for large parties. Now, we did this last league. We were making a conscious choice between switching between Defiled Cathedral farming and rarity stacking on Kirac maps and seeing how they fare. But there is no reason why you can't combine both strategies and do them at the same time if there is a map with a good div card. Now, luckily, there is a decent map in the pool that you can farm this league. And if you've spotted it, it is Arsenal. Arsenal doesn't have the most amazing layout. However, there are a few things that make it okay. I think if you're going for a heavy breach strat, which you should, because you can leverage MF and party quant multipliers to get more splinters, most of the breaches you'll get are fairly open. But there are a few spots where this can brick, where it spawns in a corner, and it can be really bad. But I'd say most of them are fine, and breach is a pretty good mechanic to put in Arsenal. On top of that, there is a laundry list of pretty good cards for you to farm, mainly the Patient. Now, it's not as good per map as Apothecary, but it is a good card that you can farm consistently. On top of that, there are other cards like Dying Anguish, which gives you a random alternate quality gem, 3 Faces in the Dark, which provides you a consistent stream of chaos, and the Warlord card will vendor into 20 fusings when you complete a set. Overall, the map is probably the best selection of all of the available T14s, 15s, and 16s. This is probably the one thing I would try if I was trying to put together a juiced 6-man grouping strat. The alternative is to do T13 Defiled Cathedrals, but in this situation, you lose out completely on altar packs. Additionally, you lose out on all of the altar mods, which is quant and rarity. It's really tough to say if that would be worth it. Apothecary card is insanely strong for its output per map, but I think losing altars altogether might be too big of a blow to consider doing this, especially when Arsenal is a decent alternative. So if you choose to do something like Arsenal, you're going to be able to leverage rarity on a Culler and farm for the card using boxes. That combo together can be very strong. So what does the mapping strategy look like? So if you're doing a strat like this, your scarabs are going to look something like Breach Ambush, obviously, and then Div Reliquary. My guess is Abyss is probably shit and not worth the scarab slot, but maybe you could try it out and maybe it's okay. Your sextants are almost certainly going to be 500% enraged, or 600% if you can get your hands on it. Soul gain prevention, so you can abuse the soul gain. Makes your whole party more survivable. Now, if you get your party to the point where you feel like this isn't necessary, the soul gain that is, you could drop the soul gain and run +2 boxes because we're going to be running the enraged sextant. I think ideally you replace the soul gain prevention sextant with +2 boxes eventually when your characters can handle it. With this particular strategy, you're getting the best that MF has to offer from all facets. You're leveraging rarity from the Culler to get uniques from the Kirac mod. On top of that, that rarity is going into the conversions, not from your character, but from the Kirac mod. On top of that, you're able to do div card farming because you're putting enraged on it and ambushes on the map device. And because you're running a good layout with a good card, the winged div isn't wasted. And last of all, because you're putting Breach and scaling Breach on the Atlas tree, you can MF Breach Splinters. And depending on how the economy is going, MFing those Breach Splinters could be very, very lucrative in a party. So to summarize, you basically have 3 really good avenues of scaling with your map here. One of them is the fact that you can MF Breach Splinters. The second is that you can scale rarity through the Kirac mod and get a bunch more from the rares, as well as just more uniques from your map in general. The third scaler, of course, is just being the fact that you're running a good map with a good div card, and boxes are going to be a lot of bang for your buck. All of those scalers together, it should make for a pretty good mapping experience for 6-man, I estimate. But who knows what kind of hidden GGG fuck you mod like they put in the past. Because we do know historically they've done shit like this in the game where they just add hidden penalties to player and party rarity. So we'll see. We'll just see how it goes. Now, obviously, since I'm not playing, I'm not going to be able to try this out myself. I'm interested to hear what other people do and how they think that these mechanics are good in a party. I think if you combine all these mechanics and breaches are favorable, there might be a place to MF in a 6-man party and for it to actually feel pretty okay. The main thing that we encountered last league in a 6-man is that it felt bad having a catch-22 where you had to choose between running Kirac maps or farming a good layout for a good div card. And unfortunately, the only thing that is permitting this is just a roll of the dice on what maps GGG puts on the T14s, 15s, and 16s, because the Kirac maps need to be a natural 16. This honestly feels a little bit bad and a little bit of a dice roll. Like, is your MFing league going to be poor just because the selection of maps isn't good? It's leading to a very bad dynamic that I don't necessarily like. However, this league in particular should be pretty okay if you do target Arsenal, you target Breach and try to MF them, scale them with party quant, party, character quant, and all of that stuff. There should be a lot of scalers there that you have access to make partying not feel like you have a dunce cap on and you should just be splitting and playing solo. There are, of course, other activities you do have access to in the form of like getting together 2 or 3 people and then doing like 5-way carries, doing feared, this kind of thing. But honestly, those are really only opportunities for duos for the most part. I think as soon as you add a 3rd and or 4th person, your options become super limited. And if I were personally playing, I would 100% do this particular strategy and just pray that breaches can carry your income, because this is one thing they are introducing that does scale with party quant and or player quant. It could become one sort of niche for parties to magic find, but we'll have to see, of course. I am going to include this POE planner tree as well in the description. It's a pretty cookie cutter MFing tree from what you've seen in the past. It has all the quant in the middle. It has all the effective mods on top. And then basically it's just taking the box nodes that are important here, as well as a shit ton of breach stuff all over the tree. I think Eater altars are probably going to be preferred here just because of the pathing, but you could easily swap this over to Exarch Influence if you'd like. But yeah, that about sums it up for me. As I said before, I personally am not going to be playing this league. I'm going to be taking a quick hiatus until the POE 2 beta in the summer, but I hope you guys all have a good time. I'll be popping in on my phone. You might see me in some Twitch chats. But yeah, I hope you guys all enjoy. If you have any specific questions about any of the builds or anything like that, you can always ask them in the comments down there. You can also DM me on Discord. I'll put my ID in there. I try to be as helpful as I can for the community because gatekeeping info, knowledge, bad. And it triggers me when people in POE do it, okay? But yeah, I love you all. Thanks for all for watching. We'll see you next league. Have fun in the Crucible League. Goodbye.